This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode number 276 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. It's Black Friday for everybody out there listening, and for this special Black Friday episode of the podcast, we're going to talk about barrel-aged stouts. It's like this is the day for doing that, and joining me on this special Black Friday episode of the podcast is Kyle Carbaugh from Wiley Roots. Welcome to the podcast, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
The occasion is a good one. Wiley Roots had a Best in Beer, one of our top 20 beers of 2022, as covered in the Best in Beer issue. And, and so I thought, hey, this is a good excuse to come talk about barrel-aged stouts on Black Friday with one of our favorite, a beer that rated 100 with the blind judges of Craft Beer and Brewing. And so we're going to do that.
Yeah, sounds like a great plan.
It makes so much sense in my head, right? So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about some other beers that Wiley Roots makes, things like tart fruit beers. We're not going to call them sour. It's not really even that sour necessarily,
They used to be.
Things have changed.
Things have changed a lot.
Positively, I think. We're going to talk again about these progressive styles that Wiley Roots focuses on. Barrel-aged beers, American fruited tart beers, fruited IPAs, milkshake IPAs, these kinds of, fun things that you all brew a lot of out here, and some of the things that make it out there into the broader world through routes like Tavour and other things where people have probably grown more familiar outside of the local Colorado audience that has more access to a wider range of the beers. We're going to talk about all of those things, but first, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chiller's engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Kyle's got a large GD Chillers chiller out front that I noticed. It was cranking away as I walked in.
Yeah, it greets everyone on the way in.
It does. Also, still emptying those overflowing waste bins full of low fills, crushed and damaged cans, or undercarbonated beer every canning day. It's time to fill like a pro. Email contact us at probrew.com for more information on ProFill can fillers from ProBrew. ProFill can fillers use rotary true counter-pressure gravity filling and seaming technology to run at speeds of 100 to 300 cans per minute with less than 30 parts per billion DO pickup and less than 1% product waste at the filler. Stop wasting perfectly good beer. Email ProBrew at contactus@probrew.com today. ProBrew is a subsidiary of Technoblend, now a ProMock brand. So Kyle, give us the Wiley Roots story. What's your arc through craft beer look like? And then how did you get into the professional side of craft beer? Decide to launch a brewery out here in Greeley, Colorado.
Sure. So I actually grew up in Greeley. At the time that I started brewing, it was home brewing, right? On my stovetop at home, 5 gallons at a time, making relatively pedantic, not really all that interesting, and mildly infected beer, as we all start with home brewing. I was actually doing that at my house in Denver. It was one of those things that was born out of kind of a corporate career, I guess lull, if you will. I was actually a CPA. I worked for a Big Four accounting firm before starting the brewery, and Miranda, my wife, and now business partner, which is a very fun and interesting dynamic as well.
Sure.
She said, you really need a hobby because you get home and you're just zoning out and not very productively zoning out. So you should really consider doing something. I was like, okay. So we ended up having a conversation with one of my buddies, just completely randomly and completely unrelated, who also worked at the accounting firm. And he just mentioned one day that he brewed his own beer. I was like, wait, what? You do what?
Right.
I don't know anything about this. So, so he just kind of like, I guess planted the seed, and then it just went completely rampant from there. Went from brewing 5-gallon batches on the stovetop to brewing 15-gallon batches in the basement to buying a pilot system and planting it in my parents' old horse barn up in Greeley. It was actually one of the conversations that's kind of interesting about the arc of Wiley Roots. The building that we're in used to be another brewery. And when it was that other brewery, we came in, patronized them, and sat down and had a chat with just me and my parents about, hey, if we're going to do this, we're going to get some additional equipment, figure out how to go on this route to going pro. Do we get some just, nondescript real estate or rental space in Denver, or do we go it a different way? And they said, well, we got this old 1,200 square foot horse barn that has concrete floors and utilities to it, and why don't you, do it there? And that was kind of the birth of what is now Wiley Roots. So,
and then you from the parents' horse barn where you were piloting. How did Wiley Roots, the brewery, then come into being?
Yeah.
And how did you end up taking back over and then growing and expanding on that brewery where you had some of those initial formative meetings?
Yeah. So we originally just intended to pilot brew and do some home brewing out of the horse barn. But at the same time, some equipment came available from Upslope Brewing Company.
Sure.
We ended up buying a couple of their old 7-barrel fermenters, and we shoved those into the horse barn, which were they were a bit tall for what the horse barn was.
Yeah.
Brought those in. Had a little more beer, like brew sculpture, flat brew sculpture. There we go. And continued to look for commercial real estate that would be a good, presence, a good like retail presence, because we only ever really intended to be a nano brewery, which is a bit of an interesting
worked out a little differently for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting semicolon on the arc, but
yeah.
So we started out brewing 20 gallons at a time into 7-barrel fermenters, and it was very much not like it was thought out, but not from like, all right, is this how everybody does it? We tried to have those conversations, but at the time it was very much like, and I think this goes for a lot of homebrewers that start, is like that imposter syndrome of like, I want to approach this conversation with this professional brewer of like, I know what I'm doing, but at the same time, I have no idea what I'm doing. So the question of like, hey, I'm going to do this 20-gallon system into 7-barrel fermenters. Does that make sense? That conversation should have happened, and it didn't.
Sure.
But,
and things were also a little bit different in that there weren't necessarily at that time as many, quality, smaller scale stainless steel fermenters, and of course, for homebrew and nano kind of scale. Yeah. Now that equipment is just ubiquitous, and it's actually kind of incredible what it looks like on a small scale now too. So you start making beer and selling beer commercially then out of the horse barn?
Actually, no, we were just making beer just to pretty much give away, just to figure out process, figure out recipes.
What about what year was this?
This was 2010.
Oh, okay.
So relatively early on.
Sure.
Yep. And then after
there are a lot of brewers learning and making it up as they went along right around that same time.
You're absolutely right. And that's a lot of what it was. Is like, oh, well, what if we do this differently? What if we brew with raw wheat? That was one of the fun experiments that we did back in the horse barn. Is what if we do raw wheat? And I was like, well, I have no idea what to calculate for efficiency on raw wheat at this point, and the calculators didn't really account for raw wheat. And so we wound up making like 8.5%, light wheat wine, which was interesting when you told people that it was a wheat beer, because they drank it like it was a wheat beer. And about two beers later, conversations went drifting. So at that time, that was in 2010 to end of 2012. And we had been looking that entire time for some commercial real estate that would fit the budget, fit the vision, and we couldn't find anything. And I was still living up in Denver and commuting,
still working that corporate accounting job,
still doing the corporate gig. Yep. And ended up having a conversation with the distiller that was actually next door. And they said that the brewery that was here actually had acquired another space for their retail operations and potentially would be moving their brewing operations across town. So I reached out to the landlord multiple times. He was a great first landlord for us. We learned a lot from this individual.
Sounds like there's more stories there that we're not going to get into on the podcast. So, but
It's,
I kind of get what you're putting out there.
Yeah. Learning experiences.
Sure.
You know, that's
I've had those learning business partnerships.
Yeah.
20, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Yeah. You need some of those.
It's it's not always fun, but it's always valuable.
You learn, you don't make the same mistakes again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So at the time, we basically found that this space was coming available. We were basically ready. We had the equipment, we had the business plan ready to go, and we had some of the funding going. Quick sidebar. Both Moran and I entered the workforce right before the 2008 recession. So kind of the lessons learned there of just leverage and how to best use leverage and view leverage in the light of cash flow and all of those things were things that we were like, all right, well, when we start this business, we need to make sure that the concept is proven out. We tried to prove the concept out in the horse barn, and it worked to a degree in terms of the product side.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was, everybody's saying that this beer is worthy of paying money for, so let's figure out how we go ahead and legally collect those dollars. Exchange that, make that great exchange of beer for money. So we figured out a way to do that with the cash and capital that we had on hand, the lease agreement that made sense and was right sized for the business at that time, and this is where we landed, a very nondescript business park on the east side of Greeley in northern Colorado.
Sure.
So,
a building with a lot of character,
That's a great way to put it.
No, it's, there is something, and I noticed this, like whether I'm walking through hop farms or, any kind of like agricultural focused area, you've got the same vibe going on here. There are tanks behind us sitting on their sides. There's a former brew house over here. There's an old chiller right there. There's just stuff,
Yep.
And the hop farm's the same kind of way. Like, you have your own mechanical, folks that are going to fix and repair stuff, because you don't just call a repair person when something breaks. Like, you have the people that fix those things for you because it's a mechanical business. And so, in this kind of, Greeley is a farming community. It's a big part of the Greeley economy. There's this kind of self-sufficiency and this kind of, when things break, we fix it. And we've also always got some other stuff lying around, we're going to pull from, and so it's fun to see that vibe, it carries through in this entire kind of facility, even as things grow and progress.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the core things, with our ethos, or at least the way that Moran and I have approached, not just the brewing side of life, but our life in general, is this, try to be as resourceful as you can, know when you need to, reach out for help and get someone that's specialized in those areas. That being said, finding that line is again, a great business learning experience.
For sure. There's been, I imagine, a whole bunch of those learning experiences. And at the same time, the arc of brewing here at Wiley Roots has undergone some major shifts from the time that you started. I remember the first beer that you won a GABF medal for was a wheat beer. And of course, now you're not known for brewing wheat beer. You're known for brewing barrel-aged stouts and fruited tart beers with very flavor-forward and progressive things. And so finding what that Wiley Roots beers, what those styles were that were going to resonate with people and connect with people, has also been this long period of multi-year learning to get there. I want to talk about some of that arc of product. Before we do that, are you looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough? Think outside the puree box. Let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzer, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, packaging beer can be a daunting task, but buying cans shouldn't be. American Canning provides packaging supplies at competitive prices in order quantities catered to craft. Think single truckloads and half-height pallets rather than million can minimums. For a smooth packaging experience, also consider their ultra-compact single-operator canning machines. Pricing begins at $25,000 with a quick 6 to 8 week lead time on most equipment. American Canning exists to help share your craft in cans. Learn more about their ecosystem of solutions at americancanning.com. So yeah, Kyle, when you started this, you were going to brew some pretty conventional craft beer styles because that's what everybody brewed in the early, 20 teens. You thought, okay. And then, the arc has followed a different path since then. Talk to me about, how you all how this vision for what you're going to brew has, morphed over time and grown into what it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the craft beer industry went through this period of time where it had this perception that if you brew it, they will come. And the things that you brewed were things that were approachable and sessionable and maybe on occasion out there, but you certainly didn't build a business around, out there beers, especially in the brewing industry.
Or the brewing industry also in Greeley, Colorado. In the agricultural town of Greeley,
at a time when there was one other craft brewery in this city, and it's a city of about 100,000 people, but it's also a city of two worlds, right? We've got kind of your more well off, and then you've got your folks that maybe don't have as much disposable income as as craft beer would warrant. The fun, interesting thing about the city is that it's about 50-50. So we've got 100,000 people in the city, but really your addressable market is kind of that group with disposable income is maybe only 50,000 people. So now you start kind of whittling that down, and then you've got the cultural influences. And so we were like, well, let's just lead with a wheat beer, with a red, a porter, and here's our wacky thing, a white IPA.
Right.
Back in 2013, white IPA was considered adventurous, right? So we opened with that, and we had a good following to start. We had some really interesting challenges. We actually got flooded out in the floods actually after 2013. So 2013 was the big flood that took out Longmont and Estes Park and. In 2014, effectively what happened is an area that had been compromised by the floods in 2013 got rebuilt, and then the city came in and said that area needs to be rebuilt differently. So it was actually the construction company that's down the block. I don't want to get them in trouble, but let's just say they know what they're doing in terms of civil engineering, and the city came in and said, nope. So they actually had to come back in and tear that out, the reinforcement that they did. When they did that, it created a further problem. And so we ended up having, where we're sitting, actually had about, call it 10 inches of standing water.
Oh my goodness.
And that was in the spring of 2014. So like May, June of 2014. So all of this momentum that we had kind of created in those first 9 months of being a business, brewing on, with two 7-barrel fermenters and a 7-barrel brew house at that time. It all kind of came crashing down with this flood situation. And so we ended up having to dump a bunch of beer, which we didn't have a bunch of beer to dump, and we didn't have a lot of capacity to be able to rebrew any of that. So it was definitely a slow slog getting back to, where we could be, all right, well, this is a viable commercial enterprise again. And that took about, I would say, probably 4 or 5 months. And in that 4 or 5 months, we started exploring other areas that we were super interested in, and that was, sour beers. I always had an affinity for La Folie and, some of the stuff that I could find at the liquor stores, whether it was Oud Beer Cell or, even I say sour beers. Chimay was one of my first loves. So, having that Belgian beer influence and understanding, a little bit of that lambic side of things. Right. Was something that
Crooked Stave, even that 2012, 2013 was
exactly.
They were getting off, and we could still get some of those crazy early bottles at some of the local stores around here. Sure.
Yep, exactly. So that influence just was super interesting, especially when we started talking about like, well, all right, well, how do we capitalize on the volume that we can produce? And it can't be, relatively pedantic wheat beers that we're selling for a relatively low, low revenue point. So, how do we make better use of this? And at the same time, we had taken over this warehouse that we're in now, which is a great asset for the brewery. tons of area to that's one of the things that we haven't necessarily always struggled with is space. I know a lot of small breweries, space is always a concern and consideration. For us, it was just trying to grow smart into the space that we had kind of accessible to us. We didn't start out leasing the space, but it was something that we took over within about a year and a half of being in business.
It was very convenient that you had all of this contiguous warehouse space. What you had a little square out of this with the brewery and the tap room originally, and I remember that the early days of the brewery back then when the brewhouse was still tucked into the space behind behind the bar in the tap room, and
Yep.
but right, you've been able to expand into this warehouse space and then also take over that former distillery that you mentioned when they left and where the primary production now happens over there. But let's talk about the style. So you decide to start playing in styles, and I remember some of those earlier mixed culture beers you all started making. The Funky Couch line of beers were just, I mean, those also have scored incredibly well with the judges of craft beer and brewing, blindly judged. Some really interesting stuff. Of course, there's not a huge market for mixed culture beer anymore. At what point did you just start playing in this kind of like fruited, kind of quick kettle sour,
Sure.
tart fruit beer kind of space? When did that evolution happen, and how did you find yourselves really getting excited or interested in that category of beer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, with, the mixed culture program that we started, it was very traditional, super influenced by, likes of Jeff Stuffings and Jester King, even to the fact where we were figuring out how to make barrel stacks, how they made it. And at the height of our sour beer mixed culture wild fermentation production, I want to say we had about 160 barrels, oak barrels back here in the space that we're in right now occupied by 60 barrel fermenters. So yeah, I think, ultimately the transition for us went from the really interesting sour beers that are resonating with those uber consumers, the people that are really deep into that world. They don't translate well to the general public. And so how can we continue to scale, that interest in exploring acid in the form of beer, whether it be a mild amount of, kettle sour, or whether it be kind of on that more assertive side where you're matching, malic acid profiles with lactic and all the other things that are going on in those wild sour beers. How do we take what we've learned in those really deep end beers and approach a customer base that maybe wasn't ready for that profile, had it and decided that they didn't like sour beers, or even expanding it beyond that. There's plenty of people who say they don't like beer. How do we change their minds and making things that are relatively approachable, relatively accessible? That's kind of the transition, or at least the influence that made sense in our heads, of taking these things that we learned in the deep end of the swimming pool and trying to get people to wade a little deeper.
It's almost like you want to build a pipeline and a way for people to connect, and once they build that connection, maybe they'll go a little deeper with you, or maybe they're going to search out that next thing to go a little bit further. Sure. But if you don't create that pipeline, or people don't connect with the brand, then they may never have that experience and they may never go in that direction. And I think that's an interesting philosophical question. I know there are certainly some brewers on the more curmudgeonly end of the spectrum who are like, kettle sours have killed, they've killed traditional sour beer. I understand that viewpoint. I do think what you're saying is probably, seems to ring a little bit more true from my perspective, that, if you don't create consumers, if you don't create new customers, and if you don't find a way to, make beer connect with them, then they can have a hard time even ever becoming your customer, or even finding that thing. So, there are definitely some differing approaches on that. It seems like, you guys dove in deep in figuring out how to make nuanced, but also fun, bold, flavorful fruit beers. Where do you find yourself now? What is the kind of focus around that as you're thinking about and designing these beers? What kind of buckets do you put them in? And how have you defined some of these kinds of, products, within this kind of quick kettle kind of, tart space. Again, I keep not wanting to use sour because they're really not all of that. They're not sour. They're just they're fruit beers.
Yeah. I think one of the and it's funny you mentioned the kind of like the curmudgeon, like, no, that's not the way the beer industry should be going. I was on that side of the fence for a very long time of watching what kettle sours were doing to the industry, but at the same time, I was watching what was happening with the people that were very kind of married to that old school, old world method of production. People that were really going after the likes of Casey and Cantillon and Dre Fontaine and even back in the day, some of the Almanac stuff.
Sure.
Watching kind of what they were doing is, they were getting their fill on these very traditional style sours, and so additional players that were bringing the same thing to the landscape maybe weren't able to penetrate the market nearly as deeply as they once could. So
it was a narrow, nerdy market, but that nerdy component of the market was just, it's 1 or 2% of that craft beer consumer base, not the 10 or 15 or 50 that that might be useful for courting as a business that also helps you maintain some sort of, long-term viability to this overall thing. If they feel cool, it feels cool to appeal to that, top 1%. But it's not the kind of thing that's going to sustain a business.
Exactly. It's there's the big difference between like the things that we're interested in as a beer producer and the things that we're interested in as a business owner. And I have consistently wrestled with those two sides of, what is going to make the most sense, both from the things that satiate me or satiate my my brewer self and the things that satiate the bills, so to speak.
Sure.
So yeah, I think
you can still make pilot batches for yourself of those small things that you just have to flex on. Sure.
Exactly. Yeah, the Funkio couch culture is still maintained with Inland Island Use Company, so they've been a great partner for us on that.
So we bring it back one day.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm waiting for that, especially with Nelson or something along those lines too. That version was amazing, and it was in cans too. You could totally sell that. So now within this world of quick tart beers from fruit beers with this acid component, what kind of buckets? How have you started? Because you develop now multiple lines of beer even within this thing. It's not as if everything is in one bucket. You are finding new ways to make that whole category more broad and find different customers even within that category itself. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really started with slush, right? And in 2018, we started this idea that we could take, a kettle soured beer, add fruit flavors that mimicked, the quintessential drive-in flavor profile classics, cherry limeade, strawberry lemonade, all of those kinds of things, and put it in beer format. And literally, we got up to the launch of slush as a brand, and said, what if we took this another step further that really pisses people off?
Okay.
In the form of freezing beer. And so I think we were maybe one of the first breweries to put beer into a frozen uncarbonated beverage machine, a FUB machine, and figure out how to do it where people absolutely lost their minds about it.
So you took this slush line, you made actual slushies from it.
Exactly.
Sure.
And I kind of I refer these, somewhat tongue in cheek as beer abominations, because at the end of the day, I'll be the first one to say I did not get into brewing to make the kinds of things that we become known for. But at the end of the day, I've definitely got into brewing to make interesting, drinkable things that happen to be centered around, brewing as a process. And I think that's probably one of the biggest distinctions in the things that I've, had to put on the shelf was like, all right, my own personal opinion about this doesn't really matter. I have to have some guardrails and I have to have some boundaries of where we're going. But at the end of the day, we have to make things that are interesting and palatable to an audience that may not be exposed to beer or may not be all that interested in drinking the beer that they've been exposed to. And so I think that's, in terms of the lanes, that's where we said, all right, well, it's going to start with slush, and then we're going to go into, these, lactose-based pie expressions, which was our County Fair Cobbler series. And then we said, oh, let's take it another step further and do tiki cocktails that are, also lactose, but different ABV, different adjuncts. We can go kind of over the top with this tiki style. And then we got into this realm where the customers that were familiar with slush and tried slush loved it, but also wanted us to go another step further. There's a brewery that's really, really well known for their non-fermented fruit adjunct beers. And those, the Venn diagram of the customers that enjoyed those and the customers that enjoyed slush started to overlap, and to the point where we kind of couldn't ignore it anymore. And that's where Fruit Ladies were born. So that was their super fruited smoothie style sour tart beer, fruit beer.
Sure.
I guess is the best way to put it.
Don't want to mean to make you self-conscious about that too. My own hang-ups and Joe saying our managing editor's hang-ups are, filtering throughout all of this. So, sorry to throw you off there. So talk to me about Fruit Lady. Now, is that one of the primary focuses now, of this, or do you kind of balance between each of these lines? Are there some now that is what you focus on, and some of the evolutionary steps that got you here are no longer as compelling? What's the current state of this program look like?
Yeah, I think ultimately, we still make slush. Slush is still something that a lot of people gravitate towards because it's familiar and they understand it. But it's also reached a level of maturity where, kind of amber ales in the late 90s and early 2000s kind of got to that people have either had it before and you aren't getting that you aren't attracting that customer that's going to internally churn, right? So how do you continue to engage that customer?
What's the difference, I should say, between slush and Fruit Lady?
So slush is brewed at we've actually increased and rejiggered the base recipe just this year. We went from a 4.8% traditional Goza base minus the salt, minus the coriander, minus the German style yeast. To a 5.5% more, higher alcohol content sour, plus fruit, plus more fruit, and some adjuncts.
Yeah.
And so
you actually calculate the dilution so that what the ABV is on these.
Exactly. Yeah. Our folks at Firmly definitely help us out on making sure we're not lying on the label.
There you go.
That's important to us.
Sure.
So yeah, we went after that, slush side of things and trying to produce people's favorites and classics in that line, but then taking, the Cobbler series and taking that in a completely different realm that maybe shocks people that beer can taste like a key lime pie. As far as the current status goes, we've really seen through the pandemic, we saw a crazy explosion with A Visit from the Fruit Lady series. And so much so that we spun off another series and said, well, what if we did the same thing that we did with slush, where we take this base beer and then we throw it in some phase changing machinery. So yeah, we made ice cream out of beer, which again is, a level of tongue-in-cheek beer abominations. It turned out popular enough that we started selling quarts to go. Right. Not what I intended to do, but if that's what keeps people employed and keeps paychecks clearing, then I'm going to do it. So
let's talk about what makes these and what makes these good. That's, I think, the key here. Again, you've been doing it for a number of years now, and you've gone through a whole bunch of iterations to get there. So let's talk about some of the kind of, the basics and some of the things that you found that work better than others. Before we do that, ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery outfitter proud to offer brewhouses, tanks, and small parts to brewers across the country. They stock equipment ranging from 3 barrels to 90 barrels and offer custom designed equipment up to 900 barrels. Contact one of their brewery consultants today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your brewery project. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. Also, here's a special offer from Twin Monkey Beverage Systems. Simply mention the CVB podcast when you contact Twin Monkeys Beverage Systems to get a special discount on a brand new canning line through the March of 2023. So let's talk about this, Kyle. What is, you guys have been building and evolving these. What are some of the core tenets of this? You mentioned a kind of a goza base without the coriander, without the salt, basically just a kind of, wheat ale, for simple fermentation. I imagine that the base beer itself is just not the focus here. It's there to kind of support, and I imagine you're also brewing to somewhat higher gravity because you're now diluting this all down with fruit to a very significant degree. Where do you go from there in terms of finding the best way to integrate fruit, sourcing the kinds of fruit, using fruit in which format, how you go about building a kind of extraction dilution, how you end up stabilizing that, all these kinds of pieces that go along with it to make a good tasting fruit beer. And then also thinking about designing flavor. We can talk a little bit about that after, we talk about some of the basics here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the number one tenet that I've always stuck to is there is no such thing as making a subpar beer and then covering it up with fruit. The brewers that are doing that, I will admonish them gravely. Sure. That's not the point, right? If you took,
ultimately, it's hard to be successful if you do it that way.
It translates into every other realm. For us, we've always said, the base beer really has to stand on its own. If the base beer doesn't stand on its own, then what's the point? So starting with a good quality base beer that's, doesn't have the isovaleric acid components or any of those, funky, weird feet vomit things that you get from improperly kettle souring. And we're still doing a lot of kettle souring. I know there's a lot of breweries that have gone to just acid dosing on, a blonde ale effectively. Mm-hmm. We're still doing the kettle souring. That may change and evolve.
Why? What's the difference?
Just pitching acid.
Sure.
So instead of,
right now you can buy like 88%, food grade lactic acid and just add that in. And we should say, you actually don't need to even add a whole bunch of it. I mean, it's the amount of lactic acid that you need when you have the acidity from fruit also is not that significant. I mean, we're not making, you guys are not making, sub 3 pH, just, 15 grams per liter titratable acidity, kind of beers. Like these are, subtle, gentle beers where the acidity is really just highlighting the acidity that already exists there in the fruit itself.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's really the intention, is making something with, a bacterial component that lends itself well to to being a base for a fruit expression.
Right.
That's the whole goal. And so there are different processes and different brewers doing that via pitching acid. And from my perspective, it's just been. We like the bacterial addition approach. It makes sense with how we've built out our brew house. It makes sense with and an interesting concept on that. We actually put valves on our new brew house steam stacks, so you can actually isolate all of the every kettle from outside.
Right.
They're almost basically fermenters. They still have a little bit of
you don't have to inflate a beach ball in your exhaust stack to,
exactly.
to keep outside atmosphere from coming in while your kettle's sour. Yeah, sure.
Yep. Yeah. So we went ahead and when we built everything out, we said, all right, well, we're just going to valve these things and make it work that way. And we, I think that the acid side of things, when you start talking about bacterial acid production, there's obviously a threshold, especially on hot side when you're doing kind of a controlled kettle sour, where if you have somebody that maybe isn't looking at the beaker correctly, they're overthrowing acid and or not looking at completely calibrated tanks for volumes and all that kind of stuff. So I think it can be overdone really easily on acid if you're just doing pitching. And so that might be something that we look at in the future, but for right now, we're pretty comfortable with what we're doing on the bacterial side. So
Sure. And it's, outside of tying up tanks, tying up your kettle for a little while, it can be less expensive than, buying those
exactly
those acid materials to
and now you've got things like acid producing yeast that is in I think it's sour cerevisiae,
right,
where you can just pitch a brick of yeast and get your acid production through everything that's going on in that GMO world. And I think that's fine. I think it's great, in terms of making these beers more accessible to people. I think the big thing, for me, starting with that base beer that's solid and then finding high quality fruit that you can accentuate that profile with.
And you still just use a lactobacillus strain then in the kettle itself?
Yep. Yeah, it's a probiotic based like juice beverage, Lactobacillus plantarum, and we found that that's it's the most consistent for us. It produces the a really tropical fruit forward acidity and profile that really is that great canvas that we enjoy, at least. So
it's still a wheat component in this grist.
Yep. Yeah, we were at about 60% two row, 30% malted wheat. About 5% unmalted wheat, and then about 5% acid malt.
Cool.
Yeah. So that unmalted wheat, which is really interesting because we actually sourced that directly from a wheat farmer in eastern Colorado. One of my buddies growing up, he's a wheat farmer.
Cool.
So we try to integrate this, that rustic local component behind all of that fruit. Still trying to tie it back to that, local agriculture kind of component. So.
Sure, and even if you can't taste it under all that fruit, it still
makes you feel good.
Makes you feel good, And I imagine that like the heft of some of that kind of helps, support some of the higher end and sweeter flavors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The dextrin component, the bodybuilding things that take place with unmalted wheat. I think that you can't taste it, but you can perceive it. It definitely has. It makes that base beer stand up to the fruit component a little bit more, I think.
It's interesting to think about it too, because you're also building texture in this, and oftentimes when we think about texture in these beers, we think about that coming from sugar.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I think is most interesting about that. We were making some spontaneous beer there for a little while using unmalted wheat, and actually using the wheat from my good friend, longtime friend, and I think that was one of the things of like maybe it was subconscious of like, all right, if we're gonna maybe I don't want to say compromise, but we're gonna set these other super altruistic curmudgeon-y brewer things, if we're going to set all that on the shelf, well, at least we're going to carry forward the raw wheat. So
hold on to that.
Exactly.
Sure. So then, so you create this acidic base beer, or slightly acidic base beer, really, but kind of substantial, supportive base beer. And it's the same beer then across the mark for, depending, or do you change it based on what fruit you were intending to add to each batch?
We look at it more in terms of lane. So our slush lane definitely gets the same base, and then we look at the same kind of fruiting rates. We're using a lot of whole fruit pureés as kind of the shining star for that series. We augment that depending upon the fruit. If we want to have a little bit more punchiness, cherry is a really good example. When you use sweet cherry puree, you're getting a lot of flesh material in it. You get a lot of tannin contribution without a lot of either sweetness contributed, or without a lot of that like super ripe cherry contribution. So trying to balance that out in terms of between using whole fruit puree and then juice concentrates, blending those together so that you get this more full rounded fruit expression in the beer. That's kind of a big component of the production of slush itself. Now, when we start talking about cobbler, we aren't necessarily looking for the full fruit expression, because there's so much else going on in that beer, whether it be, the mouthfeel, the body, the residual sweetness from lactose, or whether it be the cinnamon, graham cracker, vanilla that we're adding on the backside as well to really emulate those pie aspects. As we get into Fruit Lady, that's a completely different situation where, it's definitely still heavy wheat, but we also add in some oats. And then instead of brewing that to about 5.5%, we're actually brewing it to almost 9%. Understanding that we're not fermenting out the fruit. So we're getting no alcohol contribution from the fruit, which ultimately just results in dilution. So with that dilution, we're looking at about a 30 to 40% by volume dilution. So it takes that 9% beer down to neighborhood of about 4.5 to 5%, depending upon the base beer.
And so then your slushes that you're brewing to 5% probably end up in the low 4s.
So with those, we're still fermenting out the fruit. So
okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So the fruit component that goes in, obviously that
there's a dilution and a fermentation alcohol component to it too. Okay.
Exactly.
Kind of offsets.
Yep.
Sure.
Exactly. So that's where we try to get to that 5% after dilution, but with fermentation. The residual gravity that we see from those fruit contributions in slush are actually surprisingly low. We don't see a lot of final gravity contribution from those fruit additions.
Interesting. So why ferment it out in something like slush, and why leave more unfermented, in some of these bigger ones?
Yeah. So with the Fruit Lady stuff, we're really going after that full fruit expression, from terpenes to flesh to fruit, fruit flavor, and even the fruit sweetness. With slush, it really is intended to still be a super drinkable, really refreshing drink. I don't have any problem having 2 to 3 slush beers in a setting. If I have a half of a Fruit Lady in a setting, it's about the only thing that I want to have that's not bourbon at that point.
Sure. So then you mix this, and I like that idea. I mean, I'm certainly talking to other brewers like Tanya Cornett of 10 Barrel this past summer. She's mentioning the same thing, often using fruit in multiple formats in order to build this round idea of the fruit, because one format doesn't always give you that full thing. And so sometimes, whether it's dried or whether it's juice, whether it's even potentially extract, in small amounts on top of some of that puree, when sometimes using as many as 3 or 4 different forms of that same fruit, that often can add different elements of this overall flavor that people perceive with it. You're playing, that kind of mental, that psychological game. How do you, as you designing some of these beers, how do you approach that from a creative standpoint, and how do you, make some decisions around what form you're going to use, and then, figuring out what kinds of quantities to use some of these things in order to pull out those best kinds of flavor? What's that creative process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we rely, or at least I rely really heavily on, historic experience of, all right, well, we did that cherry, but it didn't really come out exactly how we wanted it to, or we did that strawberry and it didn't quite hit the mark in terms of full spectrum of flavor. So we rely really heavily on those experiences of, where it didn't quite meet where we wanted it to be, or it got 90% of the way there, but the last 10% you can really, how do we hone in on that last 10%? And so a lot of it's experience, but the boundaries are the guidelines, and for those, who are looking to kind of make these things either at home or other professional brewers, the experience that we've had is roughly about 2/3 puree and then 1/3 juice concentrate. That usually gets us that 90% of the way there. And then looking at things like essential oils, or even, freeze-dried fruit powder. I know nuts.com has a lot of those kinds of products too.
Yeah.
Or even getting into some of the, the extracts, the natural extracts that give you that top note.
Zests
are a perfect example. Yep. All of our citrus is actually whole fruit puree that we then run through a masticating juicer, which is an interesting, it's a fun word to say, masticating juicer. But basically it's got like an auger that presses.
Chewing, right?
It's chewing. Yeah. So that
there's lots of masticators out here in Greeley, by the way. You've got a great mastication technology.
Just a quarter mile down the road.
Okay, yeah, that's all around over here. Sure.
He's talking about the ruminants.
Yes. Yeah.
Ruminant nutrition.
Lots of cattle farming out here in this area. Sure.
Yep. So yeah, that juicer does a great job. It doesn't.
So why use a juicer then with this puree? And aseptic puree, I assume, or
it's actually stuff that we're doing in house.
Really?
Yeah, we're taking.
You're just making your own purees here.
Yep. Yeah, okay. We take whole limes, whole lemons. If we're doing grapefruit, we'll do whole grapefruit. Run it through. We actually invested in this massive. I say massive. It doesn't come across as massive until you're in the market for a food processor. But yeah, it's a commercial/industrial food processor that will take whole lemons and beat them to a pulp within about 10 seconds.
Whole lemons with the skins on.
With the skins on, yeah.
And you just throw it in there.
Just throw it in there.
Purees the crap out of it.
Purees the hell out of it.
Huh.
And then
with the peel and everything, or does it
everything.
Does it take the peel off?
Everything. It's just it's a monster.
Okay.
So yeah, we just beat it into
a pulp. You will just use that entire thing, peel, pith, and fruit flesh for some of these fruits.
Everything. Yep. And then we throw it through the juicer, and effectively what the juicer does is it expresses all of that peel, pith. It gets all of the the juice content out of the actual like whole fruit, and we're left with this almost like creamy slurry almost that we then add to the tank. And what we find is that we don't get the extraction on bitterness from the peel and pith of the beer actually sitting on that whole component. It spits out all of the the connective tissue within the actual the interior of the fruit. But
so no pulp in these.
Effectively no pulp.
Yeah.
But the amount of like essential oil, natural oil expression that we get out of citrus, we'll do a 30-barrel batch with 8 pounds of limes.
Huh.
It's incredible. So you're
so
just
still getting oil out of the peel, maybe, but just not the peel material itself.
Exactly. Which is where you're getting a lot of that that pithy bitterness,
right?
Especially if you're talking about letting the beer condition on peel and pith for upwards of 7 to 10 days. Being able to take that component out and just allow it to condition on all of the good stuff that you want that's going to create flavor but not the bitterness, that seems to have really worked for us when we're doing citrus additions.
How and when are you doing this? Obviously, if you're now adding in whole fruit, I can't imagine you can do this safely into finished beer at that point. Is
Sure.
there, I would want to be doing that where there's still yeast involved that can outcompete any, potential beer spoilers in that. What is, how does that process work?
Yeah. So,
How do you clean this up after you go through the masticating juicer?
Right. So we're typically adding all of our, high sugar concentrated fruits, either fruit juice concentrate or concentrate pureés or even pureés. We're adding all of that on like day 3 of fermentation, so that we're basically catching it at high krausen, allowing that yeast to do a lot of the heavy lifting. We've also got, in terms of like high krausen, you've got that's the point at which you're going to have the highest concentration of the yeast that you want in there. So it's going to have a better chance of outcompeting anything that rides in on the fruit. Now we are using like aseptic fruit pureés or pureés that have been stabilized and don't have high levels of bacterial or wild yeast loads, both in beers that we're fermenting out the fruit, but also beers that we're adding in post fermentation. With post fermentation, we are stabilizing the beer, so we took a page out of the mead in wine world, using we call it K-bait, so potassium sorbate.
Yeah.
That is definitely effective at your conventional yeast and basically making sure that they have basically one generation left. Obviously pitching rate is a concern, and we've played with that. The higher that you get, you start to get these like geranium kind of influence compounds, which you want to stay away from that. But you also want to get to a point where it's high enough that you're getting to a place where you're stabilizing effectively.
How much is enough and how much is too much potassium sorbate?
Fun story. So when we start looking at sour beers and the pH side of things, we find that geranium side tends to not come up as expressive in lower pH beers. In higher pH beers, it does not take a lot of potassium sorbate to start getting to that.
What would you consider high versus low pH there?
I would say anything under about 3.8, which is about where most of our kettle sours end up landing, is in that 3.5, 3.3 range. But anything under that 3.8 is really where I see fewer impacts. We actually did a lager with chili, and we ended up stabilizing that because we weren't sure exactly what the chili, like the concentration, the sugar concentration from the roasted chilies was going to be, just as a measure of safety.
Right.
Obviously, it was lager yeast too, so it was going to be a slow roll.
Sure.
But with that, I want to say we ended up going with. I want to say it was about 30 grams per barrel, and it got to that point where it was like, is that geranium or is that chili? So that's the upper threshold on something like that. But we'll get up to maybe about 100 grams per barrel on some of our stuff that we want to make sure that it's very, very it's dealt with.
Sure.
So to speak. So
are there any fruits that don't work well through your own kind of processing and masticating juicer process. Things that you find they're better to get processed than to try to crank out yourself. It sounds like citrus becomes a thing that you do a lot of then yourself. Are there some things that don't work well through that process?
I think, one of the things that we do, and it's my least favorite thing to do, is watermelon. It's such a weird fruit when you process it as a whole fruit, that it gets so squashy, especially if you add any kind of heat treatment to it. It turns me off on anything that's watermelon. So with watermelon, we end up leaning more towards those extracts and trying to find those flavors that make a lot of sense. There's also a lot of really bad extracts out there that are completely overused.
Sure.
But with watermelon, we find that, the best way to deliver on what customers really want with watermelon is to, lean more heavily. Obviously, we still use a lot of watermelon, like puree or juice concentrate, but anytime you apply heat in that production process, especially in the aseptic world, it just gets super squashy.
Yeah.
So,
do you ever cook, try to try to pasteurize, this stuff after it comes out of your juicer before you add it into beer itself?
We have that's where we learned the
don't do it with watermelon.
Don't do it with watermelon. But with the citrus stuff, in terms of the gravity contribution, we're looking at less than 4 points of specific gravity that we're adding in a maybe. By the time we get through with it, with 8 pounds of limes or lemons, we might have a half a gallon that we're adding to the mix. So as long as we're adding that somewhere where the yeast is still kind of happy, it can go later on than when we're adding the fruit puree and the juice concentrates. We can obviously add that a little bit later, but as long as it's going in when the yeast is still doing its thing and hasn't been cold crashed, then we're usually spot on with that.
Sounds like a relatively small amount of fruit, relative to the flavor impact that you're getting from this. Do you attribute that to then, this process? And I mean, I guess you could probably also look at an ROI on a system like a, food, commercial grade food processor and masticating juicer, as by buying raw fruit versus buying processed fruit, which is expensive, harder to source. Obviously, a lot of those companies have been having a hard time maintaining their own supply. I mean, what does the ROI look like on that from a commercial perspective?
Right.
I think it's actually kind of interesting because I could see, especially if you're getting a more intense flavor impact from that could have some real positives in this overall.
Exactly. I mean, with the way that we're processing citrus, it gets to the point where you're getting a level of concentration without having to, invest in, like a distillation system for essential oils, right? But also you're getting expressions within that fruit that you won't necessarily get from a commercial fruit puree purveyor. And it's weird because we worked with Source of Nature, who's literally we named a beer series after the fruit ladies behind Source of Nature in Wellington, and so we have loved working with them. They're a great business partner of ours. But in terms of citrus, the things that we perceive, the way that we think about beer and try to produce these beers, going through that extra step of bringing in the puree side of things in-house and going through that additional step with the juicer, it's made a lot of sense from us from a just end result side of things. Now, if you go back to the ROI and the business side of me, it probably says, yeah, that wasn't worth spending $5,000 on a okay. food processor.
Fair enough.
That being said, you're able to unlock components that you otherwise couldn't unlock with those two pieces of equipment. So,
and that is another interesting thing. Then you can source, unprocessed raw fruit of all kinds and create your own purees from that versus buying more industrial purees where there is a consistent flavor goal across that entire product, where that manufacturer is then like trying to build an average, like almost like a macro beer, so that it's the same thing the entire time, versus your approach, which can be one of, well, we have some really cool citrus of this specific variety that no one will ever make a consistent puree from, or this batch of this thing, which where you can make kind of small, you can get enough of it to make something interesting for yourselves, but it may not ever be large enough to hit the kind of volume that a large producer would need to make to turn that into a viable large scale commercial product.
Exactly. Yeah. It's one of those things where it kind of scratches that itch of, still being, a craft producer, still having, a hands-on approach to ingredient dosing, ingredient usage, without getting to this level of pedantic, I guess, approach to what we do on our daily basis of, we got to get out the double diaphragm pump to pump this drum, and then tomorrow we're going to do the same thing and pump this drum. So it gets us a little bit more connected with that, that ingredient that we're using. So
look at that. You can make kettle quick tart beers with an acid component, but do it in a craft focused way. As you look at it now, were there any mistakes that you made along the way that you wish you'd known at the time that you wouldn't repeat now if you were going back, outside of watermelon, obviously?
Oh my goodness. There's a lot of things where I joke that they're, just the learning lessons, whether it be the idea that we're going to create a commercial enterprise with a 20 gallon more beer sculpture system, and then realizing it took us 21 hours to produce 120 gallons of beer. This is dumb. So there's, obviously that,
sure.
Or even going to, for the first 7 years of this brewery, we grained out by hand with a shovel out of the top of the mash tun, because our mash tun was an old, creamery tank from the 1950s. We finally ended up putting in a manway in that brew house, and we have a new brew house, which is great.
What's the new brew house?
New brew house is a fully automated 30-barrel brew house from ABS Commercial.
Well, there you go. One of our sponsors.
Plug.
But automation was a wonderful thing these days, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We for the longest period of time, the best we could do for automation was a Ranco controller.
Yeah.
And now everything's tied into one PLC or a series of 3 PLCs that all talk to each other, and it's fantastic.
Far smarter. Well, I told everybody we were going to talk about barrel-aged stouts, and we've just talked about fruit beers, for the last 40 some odd minutes. So let's talk about barrel-aged stouts. Clearly this is not the primary focus for the brewery. You make lots of other beers. Obviously, we were drinking Czech style lager while we were talking about all of these other kinds of things. You're certainly playing across all of these spectrums, but when it comes to hitting that that top couple percent of the beer market, good barrel-aged stouts definitely make some waves with people in that world. Talk to me about how you all envisioned that project, and and find your own identity with that style of beer. Of course, there's another brewery here in Greeley that a lot of people know about that also makes a lot of barrel-aged beers. There's but they're interestingly, when I taste them, they are different approaches to the same kind of style. You all definitely have a different aesthetic approach to yours. You're trying to achieve something that's not exactly the same. So talk to me about how you envision your barrel-aged beer, barrel-aged stout approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for a very long time, we've always been focused on barrel-aged beers, whether that be, some of our mixed culture stuff, the wild, spontaneous fermentation stuff, or whether it blend into this, acronym, cryptonym, vanilla homonym. We call it the NIM series because it's actually kind of has a fun origin story with our very first approach at this style of imperial stout, finding a home in Law's barrels for 18 months. And Law's whiskey house, local whiskey purveyor. They operated under a pseudonym for I want to say it was the first 3 or 4 years that they were in existence. basically not having any kind of commercial presence
Right.
in the whiskey game, with the intention.
Just making distillate, putting it into barrels,
Yep.
so that they'd have somebody to sell when they finally opened and got public about the brand. Sure.
Exactly. So, I mean, keeping the brand completely silent under a pseudonym. I want to say it was Gargoyle Enterprises or something, completely
Right.
nondescript. We took some inspiration with that of saying like, all right, well, we've used Las Sicale rye barrels for this very first entrance. We're going to call it pseudonym. And then it just kind of stuck, that every beer that we are making in this series, where it's got a level of thick mouthfeel, it's barrel centric. But then in the instance where we choose an adjunct, the adjunct is very purposeful, but not intended to overwhelm all the other characteristics of that base beer.
So I can call this segment of the podcast The Secrets of Nim. Yes. Yes. Right there. Okay. I don't know. This just comes to me.
It comes. It works.
Anyway, let's talk about these secrets of Nim. What's your, is there a consistent base? There's multiple ways to approach barrel-aged stouts. There are plenty of breweries out there that are building large amounts of blending stock across different recipes, different formats, different kinds of barrels, throwing it all in there, and then coming at it after that, as those things age out and building blends on the back end. There are certainly other breweries that are working on a more kind of consistent, stream idea where they've conceived of this and it's going into a barrel. It's going to become this final beer down the road. Both of those are perfectly valid production methods. There's nothing wrong or right about either of those methods. There's only the finished beers that people make through them and how those express and connect with people. What does your approach to barrel-aged stout look like?
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, we've gone on an approach. When we first started, we didn't have a lot of production capacity. We didn't have a lot of space. Certainly didn't have a lot of fermenters. So we had to make good use out of that one brew length. So it originally started as like, all right, well, we'll make this imperial stout, and then we'll just carve off 50 gallons and throw it into a barrel. And I think, what we found with that is that it's one way to approach it, but it doesn't really leave a lot of room for intention in either one of those sandboxes, whether it be specifically like the beer that gets released that pays for the batch, or whether it be the beer that goes into the barrel that you cross your fingers and hope that it comes out well. And so that was our, original intention or original, strategy way of going about doing it. And, lots of hits and misses from that approach. As of late, now that we have, in 2018, we took over the space that the distillery used to have when they bought their own building and moved. Once we took over that space, then we actually had the production capacity to be able to dedicate one brew length or two brew lengths to putting things up in barrels and tying up that, that capital, that revenue for a longer period of time. And I think that's one of the biggest things that has been a bit of our struggle is just the timing of that. You mentioned the neighbors down the street. They do a great job with the way that they approach Media Noche and the adjunct series that kind of weaves within that. So with us, having a very different approach or different set of circumstances available, it was kind of like, well, it'd be cool if we could have two producers in Greeley doing very, similar, I want to say similar things, but also a very different influence, very different method of execution.
It's like two cubist painters, but they aren't the same painter.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure, it's all in the same school, but these are different expressions of those things. I assume you're not boiling for 30 hours and doing 3 mashes along the way on these.
We are not. We make good use of some more complex sugars going in, whether it be honey and some certain ones, whether it be, a level of maltodextrin usage or dextrose usage, or, in the event that we decide to do an all malt, we have no aspirations of filling the kettle at that point. What we get is what we get, and we might boil for a little while. But this new brew house, by the way, from ABS Commercial, has an internal calandria, so we can get that thing ripping on a 20 barrel batch in the 30 barrel kettle, and it creates that concentration of wort that we're looking for in a very short period of time. So, even if it's all right, we're going to boil for an entire day, then we're going to just bring it down. We're going to let it hang out at 200 degrees overnight, and then we're going to come back the next day and we'll just let it rip for another day. It's not one of these things where, all right, we're going to do a marathon boil for 48 hours and have eyes on it the whole time, making sure that, we don't have that works in a scenario where, you've got a level of dedication to that. Our focus is obviously like, all right, well, let's just make a blended approach to beers too. So for us, if we're, throwing it on, let it boil for 8 hours one day and then coming in the next day and let it go for another 6, it works. So yeah, I guess to put a finer point on it, that's kind of how we've looked at it, and we've obviously understanding that we're going to go for those longer. I don't want to say longer, but more intense boils. We obviously want to keep the level of acrid bitterness down. So using things like pale chocolate malt and dehusked carafa, those are key tenets of.
Is there a core recipe, or do you brew a few different recipes in order to have some things to blend against?
Yeah, so we really kind of vary it up. Every time we're brewing something, it's we look back to the base recipe of the same concept the last time that we did it, and then we say, well, what did we want to do differently about it this time, or what has changed with our access to ingredients? Right. And so I think I wouldn't say that there's necessarily like a blending stock, but there's multiple different recipes that are put up in barrels right now. We don't have a ton of barrels to speak of, really. I want to say we're probably at maybe 25, 30 barrels at this point. So it's definitely become one of those things that we've scaled back on. But it is still something that I enjoy doing, something that I like. Sure. From an intellectual curiosity standpoint, like, how can we do this? So
sure. And polishes your cred with a certain part of the beer world. And, these can make some of those special beers. Your customers that are, as they're buying a case of Fruit Ladies, they want to have an extra couple barrel aged beers to some celebrate with.
Here's something to have a 12-ounce can with, and then you can take it from there. So
it is nice too with these NIM beers, as you say, that you do package them in cans, and that they don't feel as precious as as some tend to approach this realm of barrel aged beers.
Yeah, I think for us, it was maybe born out of just necessity of like, we don't have a great counter pressure filler that I would feel comfortable putting up a beer that you're going to spend $1 an ounce on, right?
Yeah.
But cans, absolutely. We've done some crazy things with cans, whether it be can conditioning on our mixed culture stuff with Funkyo couch and cans, which was nutty. But also, I mean, it's a machine that we operate that my team operates every week, couple times a week. So saying, hey, we're just gonna change out a couple of change parts, and we're gonna do 12s today. It's obviously there are some dynamics with that and some changes, but it's not being like, all right, guys, we run a canning line 90% of our year, and then here's the other 10% where we have to dig out the machine that you guys are not familiar with, and I have to like think through what we did last time and if we broke anything the last time we used it, So yeah, I think it also goes to that, I guess one of our core tenets in our ethos is just beer is made for drinking. There's plenty of beers out there that I have in my cellar that, whether it be, Cantillon or even Goose Island with Bourbon County, I've got a couple of those hanging out because they're good, accessible beers. But at the end of the day, the beer that we're trying to make are beers that we want people to drink. So.
Sure. So let's go back to talk about that. So you've got a few different recipes. You don't have a ton of barrels. This is definitely on that kind of specialty end. As you're thinking about building a recipe for barrel aging now, what would a recipe, general kind of middle of the road recipe look like today? Sure.
Yeah, we use Brewer's Friend as a calculator, just as something to kind of bounce components and make sure that percentages are looking where they should be. Right. You don't want to get to a point where you're like 30 to 40% of your grist is heavily roasted, heavily kilned, right? Right. It's kind of the salt of the beer world where you're adding that in at a rate that makes sense. So we may wind up on a 2,000 pound grist bill of maybe 300 pounds of it. Maybe 300 pounds might be, varying degrees of, darker malts. So chocolate rye is one that we love. Yeah. Chocolate wheat any of those huskless grains that end up going through that that caramelization and high kilning temperatures. We love that. So Carafa 3 we use at about a 5% rate, and then a lot of we end up using a decent amount of crystal malt. Varying degrees of that as well. So some light crystal malt and medium crystal malt. Big fan of Simpsons. So we'll throw in usually 1 to 2 bags of each of those in a 15-barrel batch.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just to, again, provide those kinds of mid notes and supportive, sweeter notes, and that help give some support to the heftier roasty notes.
Exactly. Yep. And then as far as IBUs, we're looking at somewhere in that 20 to 40 range, depending upon what. All right, is this going to be something that we're going to try to tuck away for 12 months? Intending to tuck away for 12 months, or is it going to be something that we tuck away for? We had one beer that we just came out with that was almost I think it was 45 months in barrel.
Oh, geez.
Which was an interesting thing because I think I blame that more on the barrel than the beer. So
you shoot for more bitterness and a little more heftiness if it's going to be sitting in there longer.
Exactly. Yep. So if it's something that we're looking at like a 12 to 18 month horizon, then we're obviously gravity is going to be a little bit more restrained, and IBUs are going to be a little bit more restrained. But the longer aging, we try to get a level of hopping that will stand up to some of those harsher. A barrel is not an easy environment for a beer to go through.
No,
right?
Not at all. Yeah, for those longer aging intentions, do you also ramp up the finishing gravity?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely do that. Higher starting gravity, higher finishing gravity. We try to get into the barrel somewhere above 1050, and if we're trying to get to that 2-year plus range, we're obviously going to try to get up to 12 to 14% alcohol content, which gets us in that 32 to 36 degree Plato range.
Yeah. Just to be safer and sturdier for that kind of long voyage. For shorter term barrel aged beers, do you shoot a little lower than that?
Shoot a little lower. We still want to be over 10. Anything lower than that, you start having these, competitions with, the spirit that was in the barrel to begin with.
Yeah.
And it tends to thin out the beer as well. So then that contributes to the amount of, and this is maybe a little bit of a dirty word, but manipulation that we go through on the backside.
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest misnomers in the craft world, at least for me, is we aren't just taking a beer and whether it be a crazy smoothie style sour, whether it be even a pilsner or our American lagers. I use the analogy of curling, right? That a lot of times you throw the stone and hope for it to end up where it lands, right? That's the shuffleboard, right?
Right.
I guess it's shuffleboard versus curling, I should say. So shuffleboard being, you toss it and you just hope it lands wherever it lands. Where curling, you're influencing the directionality of that stone all the way until it stops. And so we take a curling approach to beer. And especially so in our barrel aged imperial stouts is, we'll taste it and make sure that it's where we want it to be in terms of coming out of the barrel, but by no means are we finished with that beer just by having it come out of the barrel and say, all right, we're done.
So then what do you do? What are some of those modifications? How are some of the, how do you then, kind of coax that beer as it comes out of a barrel into the beer that you want it to be, as it goes into a package?
Sure. One of the things that we actually learned, we were using a lot of toasted coconut we used it on Cryptonym, and then we used it on, I want to say it was Du Hast Cake, the collab that we did with Bottle Logic. And one of the things that I didn't realize about toasted coconut is in order to get that caramelization on the outside of the actual shredded coconut, they're actually applying like a dextrose water mixture to the outside of the coconut.
Interesting.
So you have a level of sugar contribution that you're picking up inherently from the toasted coconut.
They're adding extra sugar just to add that little toasted, brown element on the outside.
Exactly.
Oh man.
right?
Tricky.
It ruins it for everyone.
Jesus.
As soon as I realized that, and I realized like, okay, every time we were using coconut, it always comes out sweeter. And I was like, well, it can't just be from the coconut. And then, you go through and you actually read the nutrition labels and the specs and you're like, oh my gosh, this has, 20 grams, or basically the coconut's 20 bricks or something like that, 20 grams of sugar per 100 grams of toasted coconut. So taking a page out of that and thinking about like, all right, well, if we're getting this interesting push from toasted coconut, how do we do that without using toasted coconut? Well, then we have to look at, all right, well, what do we need to do a small sugar addition and stabilization with that, or do we just use maltodextrin? I think those are a lot of tools in the toolbox that people aren't necessarily talking about a whole lot, but also things that people aren't maybe necessarily considering. That instead of using the shuffleboard approach to beer and launching it at brew day and saying, all right, we're going to come back to it 36 months later without any kind of guiding or shepherding of that beer, I think that just leaves a lot on the table to make up distance. Do
you ever blend beer back into some of those as they come out in order to kind of push in another direction?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, blending base beer that has been fermented out, to try and rein back in some of the tannic expression. That's a perfect way to again push that stone in the direction that you want to go. That's
what goose blenders do, right? Use that lively younger beer. It's what bourbon blenders will do too. Mix those ages because you're trying to find that kind of quality of older a stock that just has that beautiful old smoothness to it, but doesn't always have the same kind of lively energy. So finding some of that from a younger stock can also build that kind of energy to it.
One of the really interesting things that I learned from the guys at the Block Distilling in Rhino down in Denver that we've worked with on a couple of different barrel aging projects is that when you talk about sending distillate into a barrel with the intention of barrel aging, you have to consider proof, right? And the comment that they said was alcohol is a fantastic solvent of wood and of oak, and water is an excellent solvent of sugar. And if you think about barrel as also, a barrel as also having sugar components in the cellulose, and being able to influence what you're getting out with the spirit, as to whether you want to get more oak or whether you want to get more sweetness out of it. I think that's an interesting way to think about beer as well, because when you start talking about extended aging in barrels with imperial stouts, you still get some of that solvent versus, sweetness extraction with the beer that's going in the barrel too. So to your point, using high proof, low proof, blending those out, you're going to get different things as well. And we do that as well as looking at this recipe, and that was designed as going into the barrel at 14%, where this one was maybe 11%, and blending those two together and seeing where those lie. We play in that sandbox.
Yeah, interesting. Let's talk about adding other ingredients into. You mentioned obviously coconut is an issue. The our beer of the year is vanilla hominem. Vanilla plays a big component there. Talk to me about using vanilla in barrel aged stouts.
I think vanilla's been an interesting thing to source over the course of the last few years. In what was it, 2017, 18, we had the big vanilla
shortage. Yeah.
So living through that and understanding like, all right, well, vanilla's not just always plentiful, and you can't just go to your typical spice dealers, whether it be, for us, we use a lot of products from Savory Spice Shop and Old Town Spice Shop in Fort Collins. Basically going to someone that specializes in vanilla beans, whether it be...
Yeah, strangely enough, right here in Fort Collins, you've got Rodell, gigantic, now owned by ADM, Archer's Daniel Midland, like one of the larger vanilla producers that works with folks out there. Yeah, you've got some vanilla resources right here in your backyard.
Exactly. Yeah, so we've found, finding... fresh vanilla beans from, we get samples and being able to see like, all right, well, this sample's interesting in this way. This sample's interesting in this way. Even source of origin, Papua New Guinea, that was the source of origin for, the original vanilla pseudonym. And it was very interesting because it had this like licorice whip red vine contribution that I'd never experienced in a vanilla laden, imperial stout before. It was very interesting. Maybe something that we'll revisit. I don't know, 15 years down the road, but using things like Madagascar bourbon vanilla. That's for vanilla hominin. That's the direction that we went, and we work with a company called Vanilla Bean Kings, which is a internet-based business out of all places. I want to say it was South Dakota or North Dakota. But for some reason, they just had access to these incredibly rich, incredibly for lack of a better word, like a lot of oil and grease. So, when we, start translating that into higher alcohol content beers.
Gotta get that sticky vanilla.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the best. We found that Vanilla Bean Kings does a really good job for
Bean Kings.
Yep.
How do you go about processing it?
We will take those and that massive food processor that we found. We'll basically make almost like a vanilla caviar with it, but we go through the entire bean. We want to make as best utilization of that bean pod as possible. I know a lot of people use the cut and scrape method where you're just getting the I guess technically that's the caviar. We just make like a paste. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of oil content that you can get out of the actual like skin and stem.
Sure.
Biggest thing is making sure that you don't get it too. You have to puree it a bit to be able to get the stemmy woodiness of the actual pod to break down. So. We'll add that in with a little bit of tincture of higher proof spirit, and then we'll actually add that to a water bath that's hanging out at like 190, 195, just to get some of the high proof alcohol out. So that way we're not fortifying the beer, because that's a no. You don't do that.
Yep.
And then we'll take that water bath and add it back. We don't have to worry about DO with that, because if you boiled the water and let it sit to that 190, 195, then you don't have to worry too much about DO pickup. So, yeah,
cool.
It's fantastic use of the food processor.
Sure. It sounds like you get a lot of use out of that. Anyway, let's pull out. What does the big picture look like for Wiley Roots? You all have gone through, you've watched this kind of approach to product change over time. You've certainly scaled up your brew house now into a 30-barrel brew house. What you're making and how you're making it in the space that you're now occupying, is certainly far from the kind of nano brewery hope that you had when you were launching the brewery. What do you hope to achieve with Wiley Roots, and what does success look like? How will you know when you get there?
Yeah, I think for both Miranda and I, we are constantly on the pursuit of making really interesting things that appeal to a wide market, wide demographic. Where we started with this, I like to call them something beers, right? Something hoppy, something malty, something light, and something dark. We started on that track, and I think, the evolution is, okay, well, that's a great place to start, but let's continue to expose more people to the crazy that we are, whether it's the fruit lady side of things, or whether it's, very traditional Czech style lager. I think the overarching big picture for us is make things that people want to drink, and whether that's a cocktail-inspired sour beer or a really nice continental lager that uses all floor malted Bohemian Pilsner, because I have to plug that. 100% Saaz hops. I think whether it's making things on either side of the spectrum, it's just really trying to create a drinkable product that resonates with people where they're at.
Well, that sounds like a great place to bring this to a close. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. Fill like a pro with Pro-Fill can fillers from ProBrew. Let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. American Canning provides packaging supplies at competitive prices in order quantities catered to craft. ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery outfitter for brewers across the country. Brewers like Kyle here at Wiley Roots. And of course, mention the CBB podcast when you contact Twin Monkeys for a special discount on a new canning line. As always, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. Let us know this content matters to you. This is, it's tomorrow. If you're listening to this on a Friday, tomorrow is Small Business Saturday. We're a small business ourselves, and we appreciate your support. We depend on your support because we would not exist unless, without your subscriptions that support what we do. So thank you all for listening. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and help us continue to bring this content to you. Kyle, if people want to learn more about Wiley Roots, where do they find you all?
That's a great question. Right now, you can find us at wileyroots.com. Fun thing in the social media landscape. Our page has kind of gotten hijacked on Instagram, so we're still figuring that out.
Interesting.
Yeah. So for right now, you can find us at wileyroots.com and limited access on Facebook. So.
And then tap room right here in Greeley, Colorado.
Tap room at 625 3rd Street in Greeley, Colorado, just north and east of downtown.
And of course, if you want to read more about the Vanilla Homonym from Craft Beer and Brewing, one of Craft Beer and Brewing's top 20 beers of 2022, go to beerandbrewing.com. All of that story is out there for you. And of course, if you listen to this podcast, I talked about it at length on our Best in Beer podcast. So there's another place to hear me talk about it a little bit more. Kyle, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.